Hi everyone, Falsthany Startano here, the internet's busiest music nerd! And it's time for a review of the new Quelle Chris record, Innocent Country. Quelle Chris is a Detroit rapper, producer, with a very calm demeanor, a sort of oddball delivery, and some very clever, sharp, satirical lyrics. And while I would say Chris is definitely a serious artist, quite a bit of comedy and satire came through in his inflection. You can sometimes pick it up in the very dry tone of his voice. He seems like the kind of guy who enjoys somewhat just left field, subtle humor. And it also plays out really well in a lot of the lyrics that he delivers too. And even though Chris occasionally plays the angle of a very low-key clown in his music, he's also very capable of some incredibly heart-wrenching and personal stuff too. Sort of like on tracks such as Loop Dreams or King is Dead from his last album. Now Chris has a new full-length record out for MELLO music group, Innocent Country. And before I even get into the music on this record, I think it's kind of worth noting what exactly is going on with the cover on this record. I mean, we kind of have a bunch of wonky, badly drawn figures all in a group, kind of stabbing each other or even stabbing themselves. He's definitely the kind of artist who likes to point out and is most definitely well aware of the follies of mankind, which was put forward on the lead single from this LP, the song I Asked God, where Chris is literally having a pretty brief conversation with God, asking God, hey man, what's the meaning of life? What's the point? God says, get money. He inquires further, and God is basically like, hey man, honestly, like I don't know the meaning of all this stuff. And Chris kind of poses to him, but you created us. Don't you know sort of what our purpose is? And he's like, well, you make all these kids too. Do you know their purpose? Aren't you gods? Because you create beings in the same way that I create beings. It's an interesting bit of circular logic that we throw ourselves into. And it's interesting for a record like this, which tries to bring so many issues to the forefront, leaving us with a track that gives us no answers whatsoever, just leaves us with frustrating questions, which I think is kind of another outlook on life that Chris most definitely has. There are no big answers to our big questions oftentimes, at least the philosophical ones. Now, before I go too much deeper into this record, I want to say the production on it is handled by one Mr. Chris Keys, who actually brings some amazing keys on this record, brings Quelle Chris a certain level of musical finesse that his previous albums had kind of lacked. So if you are into some very beautiful piano music, it pops up from time to time on this record. But don't get it twisted, there are most definitely still some great grimy and colorful hip-hop beats all over this album, just like with Ghost at the Finish Line. And even though this is a new record, new producer, new songs, new messages, this album still shares a lot stylistically in common with Quelle Chris's previous output. There's very little in the way of progression to these instrumentals, with the beat sounding very much the same underneath the choruses as it did with the verses. And even when Chris does switch to a chorus or a refrain, it's usually incredibly subtle, low-key, and understated. Chris's songs often sort of feel very repetitive and meditative and very, very quiet. He is a very subdued kind of guy, but once he pulls you into his very quiet world, he has a lot of funny and interesting things to say, even if some of those things are kind of muttered or maybe spoken out of the side of his mouth in such a way that you might not catch them on the first listen. But on this record, once some of those messages click, it becomes clear just how hard-hitting some of these tracks are, even if on the surface they might sound slightly goofy, like the song Murphy's Law, where, I mean, it's essentially about Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will. That's not an exact quote, but it is an interesting track in that just when things are getting good, house gets robbed, car gets taken away, person breaks up with you. And the songs We Want It Alive, as well as Where the Wild Things Roam, sort of seem to be about people who have kind of a savage, violent mindset and are willing to sort of engage in these acts of desperation in order to maintain what they currently have or advance themselves forward. And the track The Ones to Watch too, which is essentially about people from your immediate area who are lying about you and total backstabbers and spreading rumors about you, and it's essentially their job to ruin your life. And the song Madness in the Oasis is pretty dark as well and has these really cartoony, deep-throated vocals laughing all over the track. Very devilish, sounds very MF Doom-ish. But the whole second half of this track kind of feels like an overly long outro or skit or something. I just wish this song were longer and a little more well developed, had a strong chorus and maybe like another verse. Even though I like this record, and I like Chris's last record, I feel like this album still has the same Achilles heel. It's kind of disheveled, disorganized, not that fleshed out sometimes. I mean, this record is just 30 minutes, and some of the songs are so short to the point where I feel like the point could have been so much stronger, the punch could have been so much harder if they were just longer and Chris delved into these ideas a little more. And there are other tracks on here like Drug Time. The song is actually Drug Fest 2002, and I think Chris makes some interesting points about drugs and using them for recreation and addiction and sort of what drugs you are using and so on and so forth. But this track kind of feels like a sketch off of a comedy record more than it does an actual song. I like that Chris plays with a lot of evocative and cinematic and just weird off-the-wall sounds that people wouldn't usually put into their songs for fear of being so distracting. But I think Chris comes through with some really awesome sounds. He comes through with some awesome concepts, but there's like no song here. It's an interesting bit of theater of the mind, but it's not really an interesting musical moment on this record. And there are other tracks on here as well, especially the darker, moodier tracks on the first half, as well as the song Nothing Moves, that, again, I just wish were longer in order to make that emotional impact stronger. Again, I kind of feel like I'm caught in a bit of a love-hate thing with the Quelle Chris record, because while I think he brings amazing ideas to the table, I think he has a ton of personality, his music still kind of comes off a little, I don't know, lethargic and slightly unambitious, which I think takes impact away from some of the great, amazing, and creative points and sounds that he brings on this album, especially on tracks like The Plan and Ask God, where I think Chris is bringing some of his best lyrics yet, which is exactly what will probably keep me looking forward to and trying out Quelle Chris records into the future. I just wish he would, I don't know, just aim a little bit higher in terms of the musical presentation as well as the song structuring aspect of his music. Other than that, I think this record has a lot of great things going for it. I'm feeling a decent to strong 7 on this thing. Transition! Have you given this record a listen? If you have, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Anthony Fantano, Mr. Quelle Chris, Innocent Country. Make sure to listen to his last record too. Listen to Ghost at the Finish Line. It's a good record. It's a good record. Forever.